of tonight's program. Okay, so Claire Johnson, tonight's speaker, talking about cuckoos. As you know, it's always a thrill for me to see a cuckoo. I told this story that we once had a black-billed in our backyard. We had a yellow-billed that fortunately hit our building, our front window, but survived. So I'm sure it's the same for you guys who are on the Zoom. So I was really happy to find Claire and discover that she was doing research on cuckoos. Claire received her BS in integrative biology at the University of Illinois, and she skipped the graduation ceremony to start her first field job monitoring birds in the Sierra Nevada. After that, after a few years of that, and her stint as a carpenter, she began an MS degree at the U of I studying the ecology of black-billed and yellow-billed cuckoos. She graduated just last May, and she now works as an avian ecologist for the Illinois Natural History Survey. She's currently helping with the Critical Trends Assessment Program, which monitors the biological condition of natural areas throughout the state using birds, plants, and arthropods as indicators. And she's very happy to report that she's also working on a project that's monitoring private lands enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which some of you may know about. It converts less productive agricultural land into conservation plantings that can help support breeding bird populations in the state. And some years ago, we had a central Illinois trip where we were on one of those lands and had lots and lots of shorebirds. So it was a lot of fun. So I will now turn this over to Claire. And thanks again, Claire, for joining us.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, it's exciting to see such a big group of people. So thanks everyone for showing up. I know it's not as exciting to be on Zoom. I'd rather be in person, but I'm still really excited to talk about cuckoos. It sounds like a lot of people think they're exciting. I think they're really exciting. So yeah, hopefully some of this information is new to at least some of you. Some of you may be more bird experts than me, but let's get into it. So I wanted to kind of start zoomed out, looking at the broader group of cuckoos. So the order Cuculiformes or Cuculiformes consists of only one family, the Cuculidae, and it's fairly diverse. They're spread across the globe. There are about 33 genera with 150 species, so a pretty big group. I also just wanted to say, if people aren't aware, so I got this snapshot from Birds of the World, which is supported by Cornell. It's kind of the updated version of Birds of North America, and it's a really cool website. I think you do have to pay a little bit of an annual subscription, but they have like thousands of species accounts, so it's a really awesome resource. So one defining characteristic of this group is that a lot of them tend to have inconspicuous plumage, so a lot of whites and browns and blacks, and they also, for the most part, are secretive forest dwellers, which I think a lot of you probably know if you've tried to look for cuckoos in the field. Another defining characteristic of this group is that they have zygodactyl feet. So a lot of perching birds will have the 3 toes, oh, you can't see, okay, 3 toes in front, 1 in back. But zygodactyl feet, or the clasping feet, have 1 toe rotated towards the back. And this lets cuckoos more easily climb around in the trees. And so I wanted to show a video. I practiced this with Sunny, so let's hope that it works okay. And so it's actually really hard to find videos of cuckoos online. But I just want to point out like how weird it is that this large bird would rather kind of scramble up this tiny branch instead of flying from perch to perch, like something small like a warbler might do. But that's kind of how they behave generally. So they really take advantage. Sorry, okay. Okay, so they really take advantage of that foot pattern. We also have the roadrunners in this family, and as you know, they're well equipped to run along the ground. One misconception I think a lot of people have, and even I had before starting my project, is that most people think all cuckoos are obligate brood parasites. And that's not entirely true. Brood parasitism has evolved several times in this family independently. So when I say that, here's this useful picture here. That term means that following a species split, a trait separately pops up again later down the evolutionary history. So it obviously is pervasive in the family, but there are actually many different breeding strategies in the group of cuckoos. So again, as you know, some are obligate brood parasites. They're highly specialized. Some may be more generalists in the hosts that they'll lay their eggs in, but others may only lay their eggs in the nest of one other species. So for example, common cuckoos parasitize these tiny reed warblers. They have a lot of specializations, kind of like this indentation in the back of nestlings and this tendency to want to roll out the eggs of their host species. And this allows them to get more food and attention from the adults. But there are quite a few species that are either monogamous or polyandrous as well. And so polyandry refers to females who will have multiple nests with different males. And really interesting to me, I didn't know this before, but I was poking around doing research for this presentation, but there's also cooperative breeding, and this primarily occurs in the Annies. So some birds will have helpers at the nest sometimes, usually they're relatives, but this is a little bit more unique because unrelated females, sometimes two or more, will lay their eggs in the same nest and share duties of raising the young. So that's interesting. Within the genus Coccyzus, or the New World cuckoos, so-called because they occur in the Americas, likely their last common ancestor was an obligate brood parasite, but they've lost this trait. And for the most part, they tend to care for their own young. So they build a nest, incubate, and feed their fledglings themselves. So finally getting to my two study species, yellow-billed cuckoos and black-billed cuckoos, which both occur in Illinois. Yellow-billed cuckoos have a fairly large population size. They're listed as least concerned by the IUCN currently. They're estimated to be about 8 million cuckoos across their range. However, I do want to mention there have been significant declines in the Southwest in these small habitat patches, and the Western yellow-billed cuckoo was recently listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So this species primarily breeds in the eastern United States, and they're thought to overwinter in South America. As you can see, this is a fairly large area, and due to a lack of sightings, we don't have a very good understanding where exactly these birds are wintering and what habitat they're using on the wintering grounds. Black-billed cuckoos are a lot less numerous. They're still listed as least concern, but there are only about 800,000 birds in the population, estimated currently. They have a more northern distribution than yellow-billed cuckoos, and they also tend to be more numerous farther north in Wisconsin and Canada than they are in the southern part of the range. Again, this species also likely winters primarily in South America, but again, we don't know exactly where that is. And as I said, both of these species do raise their own young. So during courtship rituals, males will often present a female with nuptial gifts like caterpillar or sometimes a stick to help build the nest. And then if they decide to mate, the pair will start construction together. And a little bit different with this species. This does occur in other species as well, but the female lays one egg a day, but starts incubation when she lays the first egg. And so this results in asynchronous hatching. So we can see nestlings and eggs in the nest at the same time. There are some instances of brood parasitism in black and yellow-billed cuckoos, so they've not totally lost that characteristic. But for the most part, this tends to, they tend to parasitize within their own species. So black-billed cuckoos parasitize other black-billed cuckoos, or sometimes even black-billed cuckoos will parasitize yellow-billed cuckoos and vice versa, because they have fairly similar life histories. There are records of them parasitizing other species as well. It seems to be more frequent that they'll parasitize birds like robins and gray catbirds that have similar blue eggs, but there are also records of them parasitizing birds like redwings, hooded warblers, among other species. And this tends to happen most often, we think, during insect outbreaks. So when there's more food resources available, females are able to lay more eggs, and so that's when this parasitism happens. And we also see increased brood sizes during insect outbreaks. And cuckoos seem to really love things like tent caterpillars, fall webworms, gypsy moths, and even periodical cicadas. And there's not a whole lot of information out there on cuckoos, so I had some fun going into the U of I stacks and looking at some of these really old books, like The Practical Value of Birds. But back when they used to dissect bird stomachs, they recorded 250 tent caterpillars in the stomach of one yellow-billed cuckoo, and 217 fall webworms in the stomach of another cuckoo. So they can really mow down on these caterpillars when they are available. So I just wanted to mention, I think it's really interesting that even though they're non-obligate brood parasites, yellow and black-billed cuckoos maintain a lot of these characteristics, even though they tend to be kind of energy intensive. For example, they have large eggs. These two species have some of the highest ratio of egg to body mass. They can be up to 30% of the, that's not correct, I don't remember the percentage, but it's pretty high relative to the weight of the female. So that takes a lot of energy investment. They have a very short incubation period between 10 and 11 days. And they also have a really short nestling period. There are reports of both black and yellow-billed cuckoos leaving the nest after just 6 or 7 days. And after that, they also tend to be highly mobile. So for example, there is one study tagged a nestling black-billed cuckoo and then recaptured it 2 weeks later, 2 kilometers from the nest. So these guys are able to move around right away. So this combination of traits kind of puts them at a unique position in the phylogeny. And since their ancestor was a brood parasite, but they've lost that trait while maintaining some of the characteristics, could really help us understand the evolution of brood parasitism. And so as kind of like a small part of my project, I helped collect some genetics and tissue samples for Dr. Mark Hauber, who's really interested in the evolution of parasitism and also host parasite interactions. And his lab group does a lot of cool work. If you haven't heard of him,
We've had him talk, yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, he does a lot of cool work. And there have been a couple of cool papers recently that have gotten a lot of press. So both of these species are really interesting. I think they're very charismatic, but unfortunately, they've experienced really steep declines over the past few decades. So yellow-billed cuckoos have suffered an estimated over 50% decline across their breeding range. And black-billed cuckoos have declined by almost 70%. And because they're not very numerous and they were also declining, this species was listed as threatened in the state of Illinois in 2009. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about habitat requirements that could help inform management for these species. So a lot of yellow-billed cuckoo research has focused on the southwestern populations. As I said before, this species was up for being listed, has been up for being listed for a while. So obviously there's been a lot of research invested in that population. But as you can imagine, the habitat in the Southwest is pretty different from the Eastern United States, where most of the birds breed. And there's really very little information on black-billed cuckoos. They tend to be quieter and more secretive than yellow-billed cuckoos. So a lot of what we know is based on observation or drawn from broad-scale surveys like the Breeding Birds Survey. Part of the reason for this lack of information is that both species tend to be secretive and hard to detect. So they both have a low call rate. Yellow-billed cuckoos are estimated to call passively only about once per hour. So this makes them really hard to detect using vocal cues. And they also tend to be sit and wait predators. So this combination of sitting still for long periods of time and loving to hang out in dense foliage makes them really difficult to see in the field, which I'm sure some of you know. So when I started my master's project, I wanted to address both of these kind of basic but really important issues to inform management. So specifically, what affects detection probability? Can we use different survey types to improve detection of cuckoos? And what are their habitat requirements during the breeding season? So during 2019, I had my first field season. We selected 41 locations, mostly in forest preserves and state parks throughout northeastern Illinois. I'd never really been in that area. I have family in Cook County, as Rena said earlier, but man, there are so many forest preserves. It's really beautiful. So y'all are lucky up there. I love doing field work in Northern Illinois. At each of these sites, we then selected a transect of up between 4 and 10 points, depending on the size of the site. And we tried to disperse these throughout a range of habitat from shrubland to forest, which we think cuckoos might be using. We visited each of these sites between 2 and 3 times over the course of the summer. And we started out by conducting a passive survey where we just stand to look and listen for cuckoos. And we followed this up with a broadcast survey. And this is a pretty standard technique to increase responsiveness of birds. And we just play species-specific calls over a speaker. Since we're interested in habitat, we also took some measurements at every point and recorded things like number of trees in a plot, canopy cover, shrub cover, brush cover, and vertical vegetation density. So how much cover do we have in that shrub layer? And so we found that broadcast surveys, maybe not surprisingly, make a huge difference in responsiveness. So I'm showing results for black-billed cuckoos. We found that they tend to call more often at higher temperatures, and this pattern is true for most birds. But maybe more importantly, we found this huge increase in detection using broadcast surveys compared to passive surveys. So that was a great success. Fortunately, habitat associations from this one season were still inconclusive. So I was told not to include too many graphs, but we found kind of a positive relationship between vertical cover and occupancy, but so we have these very wide error bars, so we're not very confident in that relationship. So while broadcast surveys are really useful, one of the downsides is that they can actually attract birds away from habitat that they're using towards the broadcast speaker, and that could potentially be messing up our habitat relationships. So in our second season in 2020, I wanted to, in addition to performing surveys again, also do some telemetry with black-billed cuckoos. So we used mist nets, which are kind of this fine mesh that we set up in the field to capture birds. And then we attached these the high frequency radio transmitters. So this was a really fun part of the project. I was excited to get to see the birds up close and handle them. And so we started out setting up our nets really early in the morning, and we hid out behind vegetation while we waited for birds to fly into the area. When we captured individuals, we again collected blood samples. We took a lot of body measurements like wing length and tail length. And then we also put USGS metal band on them and color bands so that we could recite individuals in the field. So we started tracking our individuals soon after capture. And so each one of those transmitters has a unique frequency that it outputs, just in case you all aren't familiar with radio telemetry. And then we have this receiver unit, so we can tune it to a specific frequency depending on the individual we're looking for. And then that lets us pinpoint where that bird, the area that bird is using. So this was going pretty well. Importantly, it also helped us discover 2 nests right away, which was super exciting to see that they were breeding in a couple of our sites. In 2019, I spent a long time nest searching for black-billed cuckoos, and we found 1 nest. So this was really exciting and much less energy intensive. So things were going good. And then we started to lose the signal of birds. We had a couple of individuals stuck around for a couple of weeks, but some left after just 2 days. So I was really frustrated. We had invested a lot of time figuring out how to trap birds and also following them around. But I had to remind myself that this lack of data is still telling us something, like, why are these birds moving around so much during the breeding season? And while I didn't collect enough data to do a formal home range analysis, we did show that cuckoos are moving fairly large distances between foraging bouts, about 136 meters, and between tracking events, we tended to relocate birds fairly far from where they were the previous day. And so these are some of the minimum convex polygons that we were able to construct for our individuals. And you can see that they were ranging over a fairly large area. So from our telemetry data, we know that black-billed cuckoos tend to leave their home range over the course of the breeding season. From another study using GPS transmitters on yellow-billed cuckoos, we also know that some individuals will move up to 100 kilometers during the breeding season. And based on the directions they were flying, this did not seem to be at all related to migration. So given this evidence of within season movement, this really helped me inform my ultimate analysis. So wanting to account for this movement, I used what's called a dynamic occupancy model, and I won't go into too much detail on that. But this basically allows us to account for within season movement and estimate the probability that a site is, a bird's going to emigrate from a site between surveys or immigrate into a site between our survey rounds. And accounting for this movement is additionally really helpful because it allows us to separate availability. So what's the likelihood that a bird is remotely within the radius where I can detect it, from detectability, detection probability, or what's the likelihood that a bird is going to produce a visual or vocal cue that I can pick up on. And so by separating these two things, we can get a better estimation of true detection probability. And that is indeed what we found. So black-billed cuckoos, again, we saw similar patterns. Detection increased with temperature, but we had overall higher detection probabilities compared to that first graph that I showed. And black-billed cuckoos were 12 times more likely to be detected using broadcast. Yellow-billed cuckoos, were most affected by noise in the environment, which is maybe not surprising. It's harder to hear things when there's noise, but they were also 6 times more likely to be detected using broadcast surveys. We also found strong evidence of within season movement for both of these species in our data. So again, corroborating our telemetry data and that other telemetry study of black-billed cuckoos, of yellow-billed cuckoos, sorry. And so we were looking at movement within home ranges. So that's the point scale here, these orange dots, as well as movement outside of home ranges or at the site level. So these blue dots. And what's important here is that these are a lot higher than 0. So that indicates a lot of movement is happening. So we found that these birds are moving over the course of the breeding season, but now I have 2 years of data. So I wanted to look at what's going on between those seasons. So we know that there's this idea that cuckoos have low between season site fidelity. For a long time, they've been described as post-migratory nomads. So this means that after returning from their wintering grounds, cuckoos tend to explore the environment and look for areas of higher resource abundance before deciding to breed. And from a telemetry study of closely related mangrove cuckoos, I think they put tags on 40 individuals and found no evidence of interannual site fidelity in this species, including the same patch of mangrove was occupied by a different individual in each year of the study. So if between year movement is happening, it can also be important to account for because it means local populations can be really variable between years. And this in turn can make it harder to determine habitat use. So this may be another reason why we're seeing those poor relationships with habitat variables. So we did a similar analysis, another dynamic occupancy model, but this time to look at between season movement. So what's the likelihood that a site that is occupied in 2019 becomes unoccupied in 2020 and vice versa? And we ended up finding that both species show a lot of interannual turnover. So yellow-billed cuckoos specifically were a lot more abundant in 2020. Many more of our sites were occupied. So in this map, the crosses indicate unoccupied sites, stars were occupied in both years, and blue dots were occupied in 2020 alone. So again, many more sites occupied the second year. Black-billed cuckoos showed a little bit more turnover. Oops. Here, the red dots indicate sites only occupied in 2019, blue only occupied in 2020, and stars in both years. I also want to point out that if you go to eBird, which I did when I was picking out my sites, it doesn't seem like everywhere has a cuckoo. So that, and they don't every year, but that also says to me that using broadcast is really important for establishing whether or not a site's occupied. So looking at the kind of pulling these two analyses together, we're showing that cuckoos are moving a lot within the breeding season and between the breeding season. So to me, that says that they're kind of nomadic, and we really need to take that into account when we're thinking about management strategies. So this is supported by this really cool study by Secretive et al. From 2012. Unfortunately, they only had a sample size of 1 because it's really difficult to recapture cuckoos. But I think this is super interesting. They showed, so this one individual in July and maybe August, but during the breeding season, was moving back and forth between New Mexico and Mexico several times. That's a huge area. Usually we're talking about like tens of hectares for a home range, but this bird is ranging over this large territory. And they found kind of a similar pattern even on the wintering grounds. So I think there's really a lot of evidence that cuckoos are fairly nomadic animals. By accounting for this movement, though, we did find stronger habitat relationships in this analysis. So black-billed cuckoos were really strongly associated with a well-developed shrub layer set in a more open landscape. So they tended to avoid development and forested areas. So to me, that says that they're kind of a younger successional shrubland species. On the other hand, yellow-billed cuckoos preferred sites with more young trees, greater canopy cover, and a sparse shrub layer. They especially liked edge habitats and areas with forest openings, which again makes them seem like an older successional habitat specialist. So given that both cuckoos are disturbance dependent, it seems like loss of early successional habitat is likely contributing to these massive declines. So in the past, even in Illinois, the landscape used to look a lot more heterogeneous. We had these small forest patches and riparian waterways and hedgerows. But in the first half of the 1900s, it's estimated that in Illinois, we lost 90% of orchard and hedgerow habitat. And in the second half of the century, we lost an estimated 60% of shrubland habitat in the Midwest. So it's a lot of habitat loss, and primarily that's due to agricultural conversion as practices have become more intensified. So providing shrublands on the landscape would not only help cuckoos, but I think they'd be beneficial to a lot of species. I think shrublands tend to be undervalued, which is too bad. People might think that they're messy. They might see the management techniques used to create shrublands like brush removal or prescribed burning as purely destructive. But a lot of plants and animals have co-evolved to really need those disturbance regimes. I also think some people see managing for shrublands as being in conflict with managing for forest and grassland birds. But I think it could benefit those specialists as well. It provides a lot of food. Shrublands are highly productive. And importantly, they also provide a lot of cover for shrubland and for forest and grassland birds during their kind of defenseless post-fledging period. So kind of to pull everything together, now that we know that cuckoos depend on these ephemeral habitat types and they're moving around a lot, I think this says that conservation really needs to kind of zoom out and be coordinated at a broader scale. So it's probably not as valuable to create high quality habitat at a single site, but it would be better to create various stages of successional habitat across the landscape to allow cuckoos to continue their movement patterns. As I said earlier, it's likely that they're also really dependent on these short-lived insect outbreaks. So providing habitat at a broader scale would allow them to find and exploit these kind of short-term resource pulses when and where they're available. So that was a lot. I still have more questions I wasn't able to answer. So specifically, how do things like age, breeding status, and success affect movements? So are birds more likely to move to a different area following a failed nest, as has been showed in other species? Why did we have, I don't think I mentioned this, but we did have 2 birds that had active nests and still left receiver range. So what's going on there? And while we didn't specifically look at insect abundance, I think that's a really important part of the story. So how does that affect when and where cuckoos choose to breed and when they choose to move? So still lots of interesting questions. They're still a challenging species. So maybe some of you want to go get your PhD on cuckoos, you know. I want to thank all of the conservation districts up there that helped me choose my sites and gave me access, as well as several organizations that provided funding. Also, of course, my advisor and committee, lab mates, field techs, lots of other people have helped me a lot. So I'll take any questions. If you want to contact me later, tell me a weird cuckoo story, you can email me. I'm always happy to hear that. Yeah, so I'll let Rena.
Yeah, hi. So first of all, that was really interesting. And I do have a few questions in here, but I'm gonna take the privilege of having the mic here to tell, because you're talking about the insect stories, insect outbreaks. One experience that Sunny and I had with some friends of ours who were birders, we were at Middle Fork, Savannah in Lake County in June on the last huge cicada outbreak. And we were walking, we had one scope between the four of us. And I'm looking over here and there's a spot in the tree, you know, white, something white. What was it? And it was a yellow-billed cuckoo. And as we watched it, and apparently a male came in and fed a cicada to the female.
Oh, cool.
And then they
What's your language?
yes, and he mounted her. And this repeated several times. And so all of us were fighting over the one scope. Oh, we want to see. You know? Oh, that's a great story. A great memory.
Yeah.
Maybe some of you on this call have had similar things. Okay, so a couple of questions we have, and then I probably have a few follow-up too of my own. Can you describe, this is from Maureen, can you describe nest location in the tree or the shrub, where you found them, how high, and what kind of tree, and what's the description of the nest?
So I didn't do a whole lot of nest searching for yellow-billed cuckoos. They do, from talking to someone else in my lab, they also tend to nest kind of in shrubby areas lower down. They really like, I had a couple sites that had these kind of like young oak plantings. They tend to like that, and they'll place the nest close to the trunk, so it's really obscured and hidden. And that seemed to be, I think yellow-billed cuckoos have been recorded putting their nests higher up, like sometimes 9 meters, but that might be an outlier. Black-billed cuckoos definitely nest lower. They also nest in shrubs. The first nest I found, I think, was in a small dogwood. And then the other two were one was in a multiflora rose, which was fun. The nest was actually made of multiflora rose. So it was kind of hard to get in there and take pictures. And then the other was in a combo honeysuckle multiflora rose. So they are using those invasive species. They're providing good cover, even if maybe they're not exactly what we want to see out there.
Okay. And this is from Kathy. She said that you answered the question, but I thought you would be interested to hear what she had to say. She said she monitors the woods near Romeoville for Bird Conservation Network. In 2019, that wood seemed full of yellow-billed cuckoos. In 2020, she didn't record a single one. Is this characteristic? And I think that's what you pretty much said, right?
That's really, that's interesting that you kind of saw the opposite of pattern of what we saw. I don't actually, where is Romeoville? What county is that in?
I think that's Cook, isn't it? Romeoville?
Okay. Huh. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, I thought like even just going out there and doing the surveys, it was very obvious to me. Like the first year, there were a lot fewer birds. It was colder that spring. So I don't know if they kind of like waited and moved on or something. But 2020, it was like immediate. There were cuckoos everywhere, which was super cool. Yeah, so they do move around between years.
But I mean, yeah, doesn't that support your site fidelity story?
Yep.
That they don't have a lot of site fidelity.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Ken Click asks, do cuckoos migrate in flocks at night? Is this known from mortality observations from towers and building strikes?
Huh. I don't know for sure if they migrate at night. That's a good question. I should look that up. I do. So the study that's actually funding me is from a windmill corporation they've found several black-billed cuckoos. So as part of that, they had to, pay out to fund some research. So they're hitting windmills, and I've found several window strike cuckoos as well. Yeah, but that's a good question. I don't know.
Has anybody on this call, just put it in the chat, or on this, on this Zoom, has anybody collected a cuckoo? If we have any monitors for the Chicago Bird Collisions monitors or anything, if you have, please indicate that in the chat. Maureen asked, would it be possible to get a list of your survey sites, and did you publish your study?
Yeah, I could send out my sites. I did want to say, you probably all know this, but it's generally discouraged using broadcast for non-research purposes. But yeah, I'd be happy to share my sites. I can send that to Rena. And what was the end of the question?
Oh, did you publish your study?
Oh, I'm working on that right now. Yeah, it's in process. It's a long process.
Yeah, I imagine.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I think one of the things that I'm just going to interject here, thinking about your study, that they don't know where these birds winter.
Yeah, I think that's going to get better. So I mentioned that GPS study. So that research is ongoing. I was talking to a woman, I think she's doing a postdoc with the Smithsonian Institute in DC. And so she was putting a lot of GPS transmitters out, and they're now small enough to be able to use those on yellow-billed cuckoos. So hopefully she was primarily looking at migration rather than like movement during the breeding season. But yeah, so that should be available soon. That'll be interesting. And yeah, as technology gets better, hopefully we can do that with more and more species to figure out where they're stopping over and where they're wintering.
So if you send me your survey sites, anybody who wants to know, wants a list, please email me or text me. Lynn said, thank you for this interesting presentation. Will you continue your field studies of cuckoos?
I'm not carrying on that project. I know there's grant money left, so maybe there will be another grad student. I'm still doing, as part of our crop monitoring, we're doing broadcasts for yellow-billed cuckoos. And they really seem to like the crop tree plantings, especially when they're younger. That's creating a lot of this lower shrubby habitat. So that's fun. I still get to see them.
So I'm just going to throw in another question here, and I'm not going to articulate it very well, but so your hypothesis or your finding is that because of obviously a lot of disappearance of agricultural land and habitat, you're postulating that the decline in cuckoos is because of that. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit?
I think, it's hard to say. I think habitat loss is a big part of it.
For everybody.
There's, as I said, like losing 90% of hedgerow habitat is huge. Losing 60% of available shrubland habitat is huge. So I think that's definitely a part. I think loss of insects is a big part. I'm sure you've all seen kind of like the insect apocalypse papers. We're seeing insect declines all over the US and the world. So given their dependence on those resources, I think that's definitely a big problem too.
Good point. Yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, I have another question from Maureen, and then we can take one more and then we'll call it a night. But was there a preference among these two species for wet versus dry shrubland?
I did see I think like yellow-billed cuckoos were in kind of wetter areas, kind of like younger forested areas. I don't know if I had a whole lot of like wet shrubland sites. But that tends, so like in the Southwest, for example, yellow-billed cuckoos really like these cottonwood floodplain forests. A study of them in Arkansas kind of found a similar thing, that they were in these like often flooded areas. So I think there is something to that.
Okay. Okay, I think I've got everybody's questions. Thank you so much. If everybody wants to, Sunny, you want to unmute everybody so everybody can say thank you. It's really interesting, and it's interesting that not a lot of, it sounds like there hasn't been a lot of study on these birds. So you found a great, I think, focus for this study. So and Claire, if you send me your information, that would be great too.
Yeah, for sure.
Sites.
Well,